So let's begin from where we left a couple which that I sent you is page 9. And the last thing that we were talking about were some extra halachot that the Beit Yosef put in that were not addressed directly by the tour. One of them was this idea that people who used to give their skins to Jews to make into parchment would sometimes mark them by sticking holes in a particular pattern on the skin so that they could identify them as theirs. And if you remember, the Beit Yosef brought out Maimonides that he held the halacha that you worry that those skins will be exchanged for other skins by the klaf maker, who in principle could have easily forged the pattern by just taking another awl and sticking it through your holes into the holes underneath to another piece of skin that he might want. But he says you don't really have to worry because they'll be afraid that that the buyer would still recognize the difference in the holes. And so we talked a little bit about that was a concern in their day and age. This is, fortunately for us, this is not a concern. And then the last thing he talked about was something that we had seen earlier in the tour in Yoredea, that there is an opinion that klaf that had not been made lishma could be made into klaf lishma by returning it to the stretcher and going over it again with lime, like as if you're starting the process again. Okay, so now we're up to over here, the Yahaklaf me'or behema chayava of tahorim. Afil minivela trefa shelahen. So the klaf has to come from either a domesticated animal or a wild animal or fowl that are tahor, meaning that they're the kind of animal that the Torah allows one to eat. Even if the skin that you're using comes from an animal that did not die from a proper shlita. Either it's in the nevela, I mean, halachically, in the nevela is any animal that died for any reason other than a proper shlita, or a trefa, which is an animal that has a physical, what's the word? Physical fault that is in a list of 18 simanim that the Chazal had determined or had by way of tradition, that these indicated that the animal would die, according to one opinion, if that it would indicate that they would surely die within a year. So you're allowed to take skins from this, and I may have mentioned in the past that the skins that we use nowadays are almost all from nevelot, because they're almost all from non-kosher slaughterhouses. That's the source, especially for shlil that we use for the skin so popularly now. They come from non-kosher slaughterhouses, and there's nothing wrong with it. And even l'chatchila, you're allowed to use such skins. There is a daya that's brought down, and I found it. I think it's in the name of Rav Hai, who says that that if you could get skins from shchutot, you can get skin animals that were slaughtered kosher, that's good, but it's not ma'akev. And it's actually an almost singular opinion, because like you see here in the tour, the way the tour phrases this is the way it's stood from the Gemara on Masechet Shabbat, and you could argue that there is no difference, even l'chatchila, between a shchuta and a nevela. But a number of years ago, maybe about 20 years ago, when I was in the States once, I met somebody who had started producing klaf from only from shchutot, only from animals that had been slaughtered kosher. And his selling point was, he said, there's a dayad, the gaonim, right? That some of the gaonim hold that you're supposed to do this. I didn't think it caught on. Right?
How much more expensive? How much more expensive was it?
It was more, and at the time, I didn't really look into it. The way I got in touch with him was, I didn't go out of my way to get in touch with him. He was friends with people at the Vad Mishmeret Stam in New York. And back in the day when I was in the States, I would have my, whatever I was working on, checked by the Vad Mishmeret Stam by computer in New York. And I think they just with him because I was going back to Israel and he wanted me some klafim to take back to Israel. And I didn't, maybe at the time I asked, it's more expensive, but I don't know how much more expensive. Okay, so you can't take from skins of any of these animals that are tmeim, that the Torah would forbid you from eating, and also not fish skin, even if it's a kosher fish. So the Beit Yosef says, "V'yeh klaf me'or behema chayav v'oftorim, afilu min habe'el trefah shalena v'lo me'or behema chayav v'tmeim, pashut beperek ha'shmoneh shrotzim." Gemara says this in Furash. V'lo midat, right? The drasha is, actually I didn't do this last time. We can just take a quick look there. This we'll come back to Sugya. We'll at least allude to it a little bit later because it talks about writing over a nekev. Zu sheila shal baitusi echad et Rabbi Yoshua. This is Kufchat Amurav. This is a question that one Baitusi asked Rabbi Yoshua Agarsi. Minayin shein kotvim tefillin al or behema tmeya. Where do we know from the Torah that we don't write tefillin on the skin of the behemaya? Dichtaman tia Torat Hashem beficha. So we learn from this pasuk that in the end of Parshat Kadesh, which is the first parsha of Tefillin, it says, "Aman tia Torat Hashem ficha," right? It says, "Vayadacha la'ot al yadecha u'zikaron beininecha l'matan tia Torat Hashem beficha midavar hamutar beficha." So it's the drasha is an interesting drasha because it's not immediately clear what the pasuk means, right? So you should put them as in your hand and as a reminder between your eyes in order that the law of Hashem should be in your mouth. So what does that have to, what is the first, how does that indicate? If you're putting, right, so we assume that Sorot of Chazal, that the Ot and the Zikaron, these are Tefillin Shel Yad and Tefillin. So how does that put Hashem's word in your mouth? Kiviyad chazaka Hashem otziacha Hashem mitzrayim. Right. So if we read it in context, it means you do this in order that the word of God or the law of God is in your mouth. That what, or the teaching is in your mouth. That with a strong or a mighty arm, Hashem took out of Mitzrayim. So in the immediate context, tefillin, you put on tefillin in order that you will come to say that Hashem took me out of Egypt with a strong arm. And so maybe one of the things that wearing tefillin indicates by wrapping the tefillin on our arm is to remind us of the Yad Chazakah that Hashem took us out of in Mitzrayim. And the idea of Lamantia Toficha is presumably by wearing tefillin, you will be of the Torah, and so therefore you will speak of the Torah, maybe the specific Torah of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and from there, generally. But it's still an odd formulation. It's kind of an odd formulation, and so the drasha is Lamantia Torah Hashem b'ficha midavar hamutar b'ficha, that the tefillin that you're on your arm and between your eyes are there in order that the Torah that you could, your mouth will be on you. Something like that, right? Ela me'ata, right? So that's supposed to teach me that I'm not allowed to use skin from a me'ah. It goes on to say, Ela me'ata, or nevelo to trefot ayichtuvo. Right, so if it's supposed to be something that you can put in your mouth, then you would not be allowed to write on skins from a nevela trefa, because you're not allowed to eat nevela trefa. So he says, Amale, he said to him, I will give you an analogy. What is this like? There are two men who were sentenced to capital punishment by the kingdom. Echad harago melech, v'echad harago ispak litor. So one of them the king himself killed, and one of them was killed by one of the officers of the king. Reise mehem mishubach. Which one is more praiseworthy? Zesha harago melech. In other words, if you're going to get killed, it's more honorable that the king thought that you were so important that he had to kill you himself. So what is so that's the mashal. What's the nimshal? What do we see?
So, the one who gets killed by the king is more important, obviously, which would be the Vela, because it gets the trip.
Yeah.
I'm putting it together.
Right, the nevela. Yeah, continue. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm putting it together. Okay, so right, the question is, right, you can only eat things from kosher animals, but what about the ones that you aren't allowed to eat? So it's better that if God kills them versus a human kills them. Like in the Velan Trefa are killed by God. So that's even better. So for sure you should be able to write on that. I'm not sure.
So basically, yes. In other words, he's saying that the fact that the Nevelot were, as it were, killed by God, it makes them mishubach. So it keeps them in this realm, even though in reality I would not be allowed to eat the flesh of these animals. but they are a level that is higher than a behemat me'ah, right? So a behemat me'ah is something that was spurned by God altogether, in the sense that, right, we're not allowed to eat it under any circumstance, even if it has a kosher shlita. You need to eat a non-kosher animal. It doesn't help it. And so here, the fact that of the trephot were killed by God, it keeps them, it makes them, it keeps them in this din, as it were. It kind of keeps them in the parsha.
And I guess I already know the answer to the question I'm about to ask, but then couldn't you say the fact that if it's more meshubach to be killed by God than by a human, so perhaps a nevelad trefa of a behemat me'ah should trump a shechted kosher animal. Because it's true that the behemat me'ah is tme'ah, but it's the melech, the hargo melech, right? And I know what the answer will be, but
so tell me what the answer is.
and if the animal is behemat tme'ah, so then it's not hargo melech, but the melech also spurned it, so it's not as good.
Yeah, exactly. Right, but it's like, right, you're trying to be menasheretz, which is which is an admirable thing to do. But yeah, in other words, the Torah, the reason the logic doesn't work is because the Torah has simply excluded all behemot me'ot, that you're allowed to eat under any circumstance. So even if it's so we also, by the way, in order, I think, to fill this out, we also have to point out that even though you might say that the animal that's killed by God is meshubach, so then you could say, well, so why isn't that better than shchita, right? Because arguably we're like the ispak litor, right? Rashi says Sara tabachim b'lashon livani. I think I didn't look this up because I didn't prepare this sugya before we started today, but I think it's just used elsewhere as a kind of an officer of the king. But Rashi says Sara tabachim. Right? Zesha haragal melech ve'elu laku al yedei boran. Right? These ones were smitten by their creator. So the idea is that you could argue that being nevelad trefa is even superior to here. It seems to be, it's just being proved why the skin from an trefa is at all. So yesh ladun b'zeh k'tzat. But there also, I think you have to make the argument that even though we shech the animal and thereby we also make it mutar to eat, to actually eat, even though we're not but we do it with mitzvah tamelech, right? So we were commanded by God to do it. So Hashem says, when you kill the animal this way, then you're allowed to eat it. If you don't kill the animal this way, you're not allowed to eat.
Yeah, it's kind of
so.
But then you could just say that meaning I understand Rabbi Shua Garcia is talking to the Baitusi, so he needs to come up with an explanation that's somewhat logical. But then you could just say as well, mitzvah melech is that klaf can even come from the velal trefa, right? Meaning.
So yeah, so here's the thing. The problem is one. Actually, about this a little bit. Let's just do one line in the Gemara. So that's his mashal, and we discussed them. So then he asked him, but what about yeachelu? In other words, if the animal that's killed by the king is superior, right, is meshubach, then you should also be allowed to eat the nevela, right? It's part of the question that we're asking. He's asking it from the tzad of the nevela. So he's saying to Rabbi Yeshua Agarsi, you're making the argument that being killed by God makes the animal mishubach to that now you can use its skin to write holy things. You can use its skin to write tefillin. But since it was killed by God, why don't we, and Zeb Hareza Mishubach, why don't we say it's Mishubach enough that now you could also eat the flesh and not just use the skin? So he says, Amar le haTorah lo tochlu kol nevela, right? Because the Torah itself, Biat amart yochelu, Amar le kalus. So he says, good one. So
what is
the discussion here,
good one?
Rashi says mishubach tamzeh.
Oh.
I'm missing a word in Greek. I'm trying to think. I have to look into it. But basically, he's modeh at the end. By Tusi is modeh. By Tusim, of course, were like the tzadukim. There were people who tended to not hold by Torah Shabal Peh. So Rabbi Yeshua, when he's arguing, he's bringing it from psukim, but the psukim, by our standards, like they're drasha. It's not. This is not an obvious pshat in the Torah. But what's interesting about the context of the whole discussion is that presumably the Baitusi held by the idea of tefillin, right? Because it's his question, Minayin she'ein kotvin tefillin al or behemat me'an. And tefillin per se are not clear in the Torah. Right? Almost everything about Hilchot tefillin is really halacha Moshe Sinai, and like a Masora ish mipi ish. So the Baitusi was modern the idealin, and presumably he understood this pasuk of Vayalach ha'la'ot yadechu zikaron be'ininecha. He also must have accepted that is talking about tefillin, and so then he would be open to the idea of understanding the rest of the pasuk in that mantia Torat Hashem b'fich, so that if you want to, as it were, round out the idea of b'ficha and not just make it metaphorical that, like the Torah will be flowing from your mouth, but that it means that you have to write on skins that would have come from animals that in principle you could have eaten. And I don't have, since I didn't prepare this, but I believe the way it's brought down in the Mechilta, the Drasha says there, Amanti Yatorat Hashem b'ficha, it says min hamutar b'ficha. The type, like from a type of animal that is permitted to put into your mouth. So from this part of the sugya, we learn these things that the Beit Yosef has mentioned. Let's go back. So Pashut beperek Shmona Shoti, right? So this idea that you have on klaf from Behema Chayav of Tahorim Afil Minidela Trefa Shelahen, Avalo Meor Behema Chayav of Atmeim. So that's Pshuto Shel Gemara that we just. Lo midag Afil Hu Tahor Sham Ba'ayad Shita, right over there, and it seems to me at some point we should go back and a bit more of that sugya, because the earlier part of the sugya is also relevant to their halachot that we'll be doing. But for the moment, we'll just take it straight from the Beit Yosef. There it's a question that was asked, it was not answered, right? It was not solved about whether or not you could write on the skin of a dag tameh, a skin of a dag tahor. Pasak l'chumra, the Torah was posek chumra, that you're not allowed to. V'chein pasak harambam. Rambam also held that it's asur, or it's right. It's not acceptable. There's because here. Hold on a second. Um, this is the Rambam. Sfarim Tvilin Mezuzot al Gabe Or Behema Tmeya Va'of V'chaya Tmeim. אבל כותבים על גבי אור בהמה וחיה ועוף טהורים, ואפילו נבלות הטרפות שלהן, ואם כותבים על גבי אור הדג הטהור, מבני הזוהמה. This is from the Gemara, because of the smell, because of the odor. שאין הזוהמה פוסקת בעיבודה, because the smell doesn't go when it's worked. So of course it raises an interesting question. What if you could do the ibud and say that it wouldn't have the smell? But I haven't seen any diunia on that, and I've never seen anybody write on fish skin. It would be an interesting endeavor, but I don't know how practical it is. So now
a quick question here on the Rambam.
Yeah. Sure.
This might be along the lines of a Brisker method of being very, very medaic in every word that he writes. He says, don't, you can't write on stam on the skins of Behema, Of, and Chaya that are Tmeim, but you can on the skins of the Behema, Chaya, and Of, the Torim. So isn't that a bit, what is the, why does he say that? He's saying the same thing, just in the opposite language.
Right, in other words, right. I think it's a reasonable question, but no, it's a reasonable question. Part of it, I think he's basing himself on prior language, but I think, to be fair, I think it's important. One way of making certain, in other words, what would be the alternative? If you say if you just say the first line and nothing else, okay, but I still have to know, in fact, what I'm allowed to write on. So I still have to say something about what I'm allowed to write on. If I only say Kodvin al Gabe or Behema V'chayeva of Torim, and I don't mention anything about Behema Tmeya or that category, I might think that this is L'chatchila. L'chatchila I have to write on animals that are tahor, but b'diavad, if I don't have any other choice, I could write on tmeim. So I think you have to say both sides in order to make absolutely certain that you only write on behemot tahorim and not on behemot tmeya. You can process more out of it than that, but I'm more of a pashtan. Okay, now we're going to embark on a very important sugya. It's going to extend actually for several pages here in the Surah in the Beit Yosef, and I'm not today, but I think maybe even possibly beginning next time. I haven't decided. I'm going to start to introduce the Shulchan Aruch, and probably also Mishnah Brura and the Aruch HaShulchan, because as we start this next topic of Nekev, we can now head into halachot that are immediately practical. We've been talking about now, they're all practical, but they're not practical in the sense that for all practical purposes, you and I and most Sofrim, we get our klaf made by klaf makers, and we don't actually worry personally about all of these details. And we get our dion made by dions, and we don't worry about all of those details. But beginning from here on in, we're going to be talking about practical aspects of writing, and it will also have hashlachot for checking, right? For checking your work and checking the other people's work. So I'm going to try to integrate some of the halacha l'maaseh more so than I have so far. So somehow, as usual, Linda's timing is impeccable. No, because this week we're just, so you missed keta here, which you'll get on the recording. And we're just about to start this new keta. We're just in time.
Oh, wonderful.
So how?
Thank you.
Okay, so we just, what we said here is that you're not allowed to write on klaf from a behemah chaya or I'm sorry, the hefech. You can write on klaf that comes from behemah chaya or of tahor, even if it's an avera or trefa, but not from any animal that was tameh, and not from the skin of a dog. And one of the characteristics of fish skin, so even though we know that you can't write on fish skin, but and we also mentioned this about the skin of fowl. Skin of fowl, actually, it's more appropriate. The skin of fowl, what's the problems with the skin of fowl is a practical issue, because when you work the skin, right, you've already removed, of course, all of the feathers, but there will be these tiny holes where the feathers had been in. So we'll see this, actually, in this class, I don't think we've done it yet, but we'll see that we learn from that you're allowed to write over if the ink goes over it. So without further ado, let's look at the Tzur. V'yesh shalem, and it should be whole. Should give, but there should not be a hole in it. Shein hadio over alav, a hole in it that ink could not go over. So what be whole? What needs to be shalem?
Klaf.
Say it again.
We lost your sound. We lost the
Yeah,
sound.
you broke up for a minute.
Oh, my sound. Okay. What
We got
has to
as far
be
as it
whole?
needs to be shalem. Shalem, yeah.
Okay. What needs to be shalem?
The klaf. Oh,
The klaf, right? The skin that you're writing on has to be whole, and and what does that mean? Shelo yihye bo nekev she'ein hadio over alav. What does it mean? It has to be whole. That it can't have a hole in it, which in English, because of the homonym aspect, it's a little confusing, right?
Mhm.
It's a whole hole. It has to be right. Let's say the skin has to have no hole pricks in it that would go through. That you can't have a nekev in it. It can't have a hole, and ink will not go over. Right. So what does that mean? So that when you're writing and you're pulling the pen with your ink over the hole, it on the face of it, we're going to get into more detail about this in a moment. It would seem that as long as the ink that you're putting down on the klaf, if it covers the hole, then it would be kosher. What does it mean? Like that dio over alav is not over alav. Does it just mean that you could pull it over, or does it mean that it needs to cover it up? So presumably, if it covers it up, that may not be an issue. We'll go into some of the permutations of this when we look at the Beit Yosef. So let's look at the Beit Yosef. Yeah, shalem shaligo lo yiyekev she'ein hadio over alav sham Shabbat, which we looked at a little bit earlier, but we didn't see that part of the sugya. Over Perak Orva Rotev, which is Chulin. It's basically parallel sugya and Chulin. It says Kol nekev she'adio over alav nekev. Any hole which ink can go over is not a hole, meaning it's not a hole for this halachic purpose to be considered as pogeh, it somehow diminishes or is posel the letter that you're writing. It's not considered to be a hole. mashma, so that implies ha'im ein hadio over alav abi neket, right? So that's the obvious implication that the Gemara says if you have a hole which allows you to still write with ink over the hole, not considered to be a hole. So by implication, if the dio is not over alav, if the ink doesn't over it, then it would be a hole. The Katav HaRiyah Skandarni b'Siman Lamed Vav. So the Riyah Skandarni wrote in Siman Lamed Vav. Siman Lamed Bezuma's comments on the tour in Siman Lamed Vav. Perush. So he explains it as follows: Nekev Katan Kechuda Shel Machat. The kind of hole we're talking about, small hole, like the tip of a needle. Ad shekishim avir alav hakulmus b'dio nistam. So that when you pass your pen over with it, with ink, it is plugged up. It gets stopped up. She'ein ha'ot nechleket bo l'shnayim eno nikra nekev. And so that the letter is not thereby split into two. So in such a case, that's not called a hole for this halachic purpose. Because vino gabav, and you can write over it. In other words, you're allowed even the chatchila to write over it. Im hu gadol, but if it would be a big hole, shahaot nir'et bo chaluka, that the letter would, as if it's split in vadai nekev. That's certainly a nekev. That's certainly a hole, meaning it's certainly a hole not be allowed to write over. So the way that the Riyah Skandarni talks about two extremes, right? So the one extreme is it's such a tiny hole that when you pull the ink over it, it plugs up. So you won't see it at all. Once the ink dries, you won't see it at all, or even before the ink dries. But in other words, after you're finished writing, you're not going to see the hole. And then he talks about another kind of hole that's so big that when you pull the pen over it, it splits your letter into two parts. So presumably that hole, right, not only did it not cover over the hole, but it even, it didn't allow you to make a full stroke because your stroke erupted by the hole. And because there's a hole there, you can't say, well, visually I can see, let's say I'm doing the top of the resh, and half of it is before the hole and half of it is after the hole. And you could say, but visually I can see it's supposed to be a resh. So that doesn't work because the hole is interrupted. You're not allowed to write in such a case. So those are two extremes. What would be the middle case? What would be a case in between those two cases?
Where you could join the letter, or you could sort of fill the hole with ink, maybe.
Not exactly. Not that you could fill the hole with ink, but I apologize because I wait 1 second. I had prepared here. Actually, one of my tziurim, I think, will be for this. I actually made this for a different. I made this for a different purpose. But let's say looking at looking at the second. So here we have a hole. Now I actually punched a hole in this letter after I wrote it, which is probably evident from the. But it actually for a later part of the Beit Yosef that we haven't done yet. But let's say this hole had been there to begin with. and I wrote the gag, and then I made the regel, and I pulled my pen. So of course there's a big hole here. I couldn't actually make this a single part of the letter, right? I couldn't make this without interruption. And so I have like half of the regel is up here, and half the regel is here. So this is the case of the Riyas Kandani. The first case would be that, let's say there was a hole underneath here, which you could no longer see because it was so small that when I pulled the stroke, it covered it up. But this one was so big that when I pulled the stroke, it interrupted. So what would be between those two cases? What's a third case that would be neither so small that it goes over and so big that it actually splits the letter into two parts?
If it was in a location that left enough of the letter that you could still fix it, or you could still read it.
Let's say more like that. So let's say, hold on a second. Options.
So you had enough of the letter that it was maybe not very pretty, but it was still shalem.
Yeah. So imagine that you have a hole. You have a hole that doesn't split the letter. Let's say it takes up like that area, like this block, so that I have ink all around the hole, right? So in the first instance that the Riyas Kandani talks about, the hole it's so small it gets covered up by ink. In the second one, it's so big it can't possibly get covered up by ink, and it splits the letter into two. Here it can get covered up by ink, but it's surrounded by ink. So what's the din there? Right? The Riyas Kandani gave us two extreme examples. He says it's kosher if it's so small that you can pull the ink over it. It's not. It's so big that it splits the stroke of the letter into two parts. But what about it if it's between that? What if it's so big that you cover it up with ink, but it's small enough that there's ink around it, and you could say that the letter still has a whole stroke? So it's from the Riyas Kandani, it's not entirely clear. It's not clear because I could be medayek either way. I could say, well, the only time it's pasul is if it's so big that it splits the letter into two, and here it doesn't split the letter into two. Or I could be medayek the other way. I could say it's only kosher when it's so small that the ink will cover it over, and here the ink doesn't cover it over. So he doesn't talk about that. So we'll see that. I mentioned earlier, I think before you came, Linda, I'm going to start to introduce the later poskim to talk about this. And there is a diyun about this later on in halacha. Let's go back to the Beit Yosef. The Katavod Riyas Kandani. Hasofrim Azrizim Osim Shosham Yinei klaf. So the zealous Sofrut, they make three kinds of klaf. And he explains what they are. Ha'av biyoter lichtov bo parshat shma shehi ktana. So the thickest parchment they use for writing parshat shma because it's a small parsha. V'hadak mimenu, the next thinner kind of parchment they make is a parshat vaya kiviyacha. Here it says in the round parentheses in Shema, and that's it's clear that that's not girsa, and the one is the corrected girsa, right? V'adak mimenu parshat vaya kiviyacha. Parshat vaya kiviyacha is a little bit bigger. It's actually almost twice as big as parshat Shema. She yoter gedola. or Parshat Kadesh, or Parshat Vahaya im Shemoa, Shehen Arukot, Osim klaf dak ma'od. Right, so for the very long parshiot, they make a very thin klaf. Just a second. I'll show you visually, if you're not familiar. I happen to have a shel yad handy, right? So let's see. I'm reversed here, right? But it doesn't matter.
Well, we see it.
Mm.
You see it, okay. Yeah, so the first parsha, you can see how long it is. It's Parshat Kadesh. And, oh, actually, I've got it. Ah, there we go. Kadesh and Vayakiviyacha is smaller. Of course, Shema is the smallest. And Vayayim Shemoah and Kadesh are about the same length. So Frimas make three thicknesses of klaf. And then through this, the batim that you put them into will be filled up equally. And this is for the tefillin. So what do you see from here? You see something about the reality of the batim that they used. That the batim that they were making, not like that we make now from that are batim, and we dry out the skin in such a way that it's really hard like wood. They were using a thinner kind of leather that was somewhat flexible. It had some, and so if you put in very thick parshiot, it would make the tefillin bulge.
Mm-hmm.
So the Sofrim Hazrizin, they wanted the tefillin when you finished putting, and obviously we're talking here about the shel rosh, right? Because I'm going to make each parsha on a separate piece of klaf, whereas in the shel yad, I'm making all of the parshiot on a single piece of klaf. So they would make a thin, the thin klaf for the biggest parshiot in most tefillin, except for like the Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, are going to be the parshiot that are on the outside, right? So you have the four chambers, and on the right side of the person wearing it, and the left side of the person who's wearing it, you have Kadesh and Vayak Shemoah, respectively. Those are two parshiot that are about the same length. And if they're made on thick parchment, when you put them in, they're going to make the sides of the tefillin bulge. And so what you do, you account varying lengths by varying the thickness of the parchment. So that's what Sofrim Hazrizim did today. And nowadays, we don't worry about that because actually all of the kind of batim that we make today, that wouldn't happen. Virtually all kinds, except for some of the cheap pshutim, which have some flexibility, but virtually all other kinds of feeling that we make now, whether they're dakot or gasot or pshutim hudarim, which are all types of different methods making the batim, which we'll talk about much later on when the end of the siman. They're so stiff that you wouldn't be able to make them bulge anyway. The only question is, would you be able to fit, if you write on parchment that's too thick, will it fit in? Will you get it in at all? Right? So nowadays you have to be worried that the tefillin, that the parshiot that you write are written on klaf that's sufficiently thin, simply that will fit into the batim. Anyway, it's an interesting thing. There are other hints. This is one of them. There are other hints from poskim that the batim that they used to make were from a kind of a softer leather that would bulge if you filled it up too much. We're at the end, but I do want to start into the next part. And if after it was written. If after, let's say, the letter was written or the parsha was written, nikev b'toch ha'ot, that a hole was put inside of the letter, it is yesh omrim afilu nikev kol tocho. People say even if the entire inner part of the letter was punctured with a hole, it would still be kosher. Yerushalmi mashmirich gam bifnim mukaf kvil. And in the Yerushalmi, it's implied that even inside the letter has to be surrounded by gvil, has to be surrounded by white space, meaning it can't touch that the hole cannot the ink. So what I want to point out here when we're talking about nekev, the part that we talked about before, this idea that a nekev may or may not affect the letter as you're, right? If it's too big, your letter is going to be pasul milachatchila because the hole that you're writing over is too big. Here, im lechash nichtav nikev betocha ot, it's still kosher. So what is betocha ot? So betocha ot is going literally the white space that's in the middle of the letter, not necessarily the ink of the letter. We'll see that as we go through the source. Some people say afilu nikev kol tocha, right? So this idea that the inside of the letter could be kosher even if it had been puncturing, that now the inside of the letter is no longer kavil. So the Tur in this first iteration, he says, if it's not mukaf gvil, another way of saying what he's saying is, if hakafat gvil after the letter is written inside of the letter, I should say that in a slightly different order. If after the letter is written, it's no longer mukaf gvil inside of the letter, it's kosher. And some people say even if no part of the letter is mukaf gvil, it's still kosher. But in the Yerushalmi, we'll see that the Yerushalmi seems to imply that you need gvil on the inside. So we'll start this part here, but this is where we're going to pick up next time. בפרק הקומץ, הרשיין בר נדבך, ניקב תוכו של הגר ירחו פסול. ופירש רש"י, תוכו רגל פנימי, ירחו רגל ימין. לשון אחר לו, הגביל והחלק שבתוכו. Right, so this was a sugya which I believe we had earlier, right? But we have to look at it again. Amar Shian bar Nidvach. Mishmei Rav Yehuda Nikev Tochel Shalhei Kasher Yerecho Pasu. So Rashi, so this is very important. Rashi here gives two perushim about what the Shian bar Nidvach is talking. What is Tochel Shalhei? So in the first iteration, she says, Tocho Shahei is regel shebifnim. So the regel shebifnim, that. Always worried if I'm sharing the screen. I actually will use this. I already made this tzir. I'm gonna change it for various reasons, but it's the regel shebifnim. So this is the regel shebifnim, and this is the hole that came along and entered it after it was written. So that's tocho shahai. Why is that tocho shah? Because it's the inner, it's part of the letter. It's the ink inner part of the letter, And Yerecho is obviously going to be the right leg. Based on this, right, you'll say it's the right leg. But what's the Lashon Acher? The Lashon Acher says, Lashon Acher Tocho, Hagvil v'Hachelik Shebetocho. It's talking about the Gvil and the open part that's inside of it. Uvitfilin kamayim. It's talking about tefillin. So what is that? That's like this. So now here I have it, I have the hole in such a way that it doesn't take up the entire inside, but this would be one way of understanding it. Or another way of understanding it, and this is another tziyur, instead of having made a hay like the way we make it now, but if you imagine a hay like we saw in some of the earlier kitvei yad, where this left element here isn't like an upside down yud, but it's just like a straight line. So then you could imagine that you could get a hole that basically touches all of the inner parts of the ink. So each of these pshatim implies different things halachically, as we will see as we examine this in depth. But let's bear in mind that according to, so just for the purposes of this discussion, and I think I'll end here, according to the first Perush of Rashi, that it should be fnim, meaning it's the left element in the hay, and Yerechos Yegel Hayaminit. This din doesn't really tell me anything about whether or not there's a din of hakafat gvil inside of the letter, because here, according to this, if you puncture this left element, it's kosher. So you could. So the question is, why would I think that it's? Why is it still kosher? Possibility is you could argue that maybe because now it's no longer mukaf kvil, you might have thought it's pasul, but it's still kosher. Meaning, so why would it still be kosher? Maybe because I don't need havil bifnim. But then right away I say nikev regel yaminid, it's pasul. But the Gemara goes on to say there. This is where it gets a little tricky, right? So the next part of the Gemara says. Rabbi Zera says, he learned it a little differently. It depends. It's not always true that if you put a hole in the right leg, that it's going to be pasul, as long as there's still enough of the regel that's left that it's kishiur ot ktana, it's going to be kasher. Let's say like this one over here. That would still be kosher. So there also, it's not afgavil, but there's still a tzad to say that it's kosher. So according to the first Rashi, you could argue that this really has nothing to do with a kafat gvil. And according to Ashian Bach, in the name of Rav Yehuda, the reason that the regel should be fnimus kosher is because it doesn't need a very big shiur to be kosher, right? So the idea that it's nikev is just a way of saying if it was big, it was a certain size when you wrote it, and then it lost some of its size, I can still read that as a hay. But if I lop off some of the hay, it loses its identity as a hay. It's a problem of Kat Ot. It's Rashi's second lashon, where nikev means that you put a hole in the middle, and maybe that hole even touched the ink, So nikev tocha shel, that's kosher. So according to that lashon, the only, the most reasonable understanding of why I think that it would have been pasul to put this middle is because now it's not mukaf gvil at all inside. But the Hidush is nikev tocho shel hey, it's still kosher because I don't need hakafa inside. But yirecho, because once I put it in the right leg, it's already touching on the outside of the letter. And we said just before this in the Gemara that kol ot shein gvil mukaf la me'ar b'totea, any letter that's not surrounded by gvil on its four sides, in its four directions. So line in the Gemara, kol ot shein gvil mukaf la me'ar b'totea, from that I would learn you need hakafat gvil on the outside, but not on the inside. So I hope I didn't make this more complicated than it needs to be. I was doing it by way of introduction because we're going to go into all of these things in greater depth. But I want you to bear in mind that this is the major difference between these two pshatim and Rashi. The first one, when Rashi says nikev tocho shel hey, means that we actually took away some of the ink. In the second perush, tocho means we took away the klaf, and therefore they have different implications halachically. So let's stop here, and then next time we'll pick up here again in the Beit Yosef from Nimui Achar. Any last questions, comments, criticism?
Thank you, Shel.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you both. Lihitrot.
Thank you. See you next week.